The fluorescent lights of aisle 4 buzzed like an angry wasp. Chloe gripped a jar of cheap pickles, the glass cold against her white knuckles. She smelled him before she saw him, a cloying wave of aerosol deodorant and stale nicotine. Derek. He blocked her path, his eyes doing a slow, mocking crawl over her swollen waistline beneath a ratty grey sweater. "Wow, Chloe," he smirked, leaning against the shelves. "You really let yourself go. Got fat, huh?" He laughed, entirely unaware she was carrying the heir to the Russo syndicate. The grocery store was freezing. It was the kind of deep mechanical cold that seeped through the soles of Chloe's worn canvas sneakers and settled in the bones of her ankles. She stared at the rows of canned soup, her vision blurring slightly at the edges. A dull ache throbbed at the base of her spine. 5 months. The weight was concentrated low, a hard, dense mass that made her center of gravity feel utterly foreign. She reached for a tin of generic chicken noodle. Her fingers were slightly swollen, the skin tight over the knuckles. Well, if it isn't the ghost of mistakes past. The voice was a grating tenor, immediately bringing the taste of old pennies to the back of her throat. Chloe didn't jump. She didn't gasp. She just closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, mourning the quiet anonymity she had possessed a moment prior. She turned slowly. Derek stood at the end of the aisle. He was holding a 6-pack of cheap beer, wearing the same faded leather jacket he'd worn 3 years ago when they dated. He hadn't changed. His hair was still gelled into a stiff crest, his posture still aggressively casual, an engineered slump meant to project confidence, but which only ever looked tired. "Derek," she said. Her voice was flat. No anger, no surprise, just the audible equivalent of grey wallpaper. He sauntered closer, his sneakers squeaking on the scuffed linoleum. His gaze didn't meet her eyes. It dropped immediately to her midsection. She was wearing an oversized pill-covered cardigan meant to obscure her changing shape, but the harsh overhead lights cast unforgiving shadows. The swell of her stomach was undeniable. A slow, ugly grin stretched across his face. It was a smile born of deep, unexamined insecurities, finally finding a target. "Wow," he breathed out, shaking his head. He shifted the 6-pack to his hip. "I mean, you always had a bit of a sweet tooth, Chloe, but damn, you really let yourself go. What is that, just donuts? Or did you just give up entirely?" He laughed. It echoed in the empty aisle. "You got fat." Chloe looked at him. She felt the sudden, violent churn of acid in her stomach, a physical reaction to the nausea that had plagued her for months, compounded by the sheer pathetic reality of the man standing in front of her. 3 years ago, a comment like that from Derek would have sent her into a spiral of disordered eating and tearful apologies. She would have internalized his cruelty, mistaking his mean streak for honest affection. Now she just felt overwhelmingly, fundamentally exhausted. She didn't feel the urge to slap him. She didn't have a sharp, devastating comeback loaded in the chamber. The heroine in a movie would have verbally eviscerated him, leaving him stuttering in the dust. Chloe just wanted to go home and lie down on her damp mattress. If you only knew a small, cynical voice whispered in the back of her mind. If you knew whose blood is building bone and muscle inside this fat, you would wet yourself right here in aisle 4. "Excuse me," she said softly, clutching the soup can. She tried to step around him. Derek shifted, blocking her. He wanted a reaction. He needed her to look wounded, to validate whatever miserable day he was having. "Oh, don't be like that," he mocked, leaning closer. The smell of him was overwhelming. "I'm just playing. Though seriously, you might want to try a salad. It's tough out there for a single girl carrying an extra 40 pounds. Inside her, the baby shifted. It wasn't a flutter anymore. It was a hard, distinct roll of a limb against her internal organs, a heavy, grounding reminder of the gravity of her situation. Chloe finally met his eyes. Hers were hollow, underscored by dark, bruising bags from nights spent staring at the ceiling, waiting for a black car to pull up to her building. "I have to go, Derek," she said, her tone utterly devoid of emotion. She pushed past him, her shoulder clipping his chest. She didn't look back as she walked toward the registers, her gait heavy and slightly uneven. She could hear him scoff behind her, muttering something about her being a bitch. She paid in cash, the coins slippery with the cold sweat on her palms. She walked out into the damp evening air, the chill biting through her sweater. The streetlights flickered, casting long, sickly yellow shadows across the wet pavement. She leaned against the brick wall of the store, squeezing her eyes shut, and finally let out a long, ragged breath. Her hand moved automatically to her stomach, resting over the thick wool of her cardigan. She pressed inward slightly, feeling the firm resistance of the life growing there. "Don't listen to him," she whispered to the damp air, her voice cracking. "He's just an idiot." But the tears pricked her eyes anyway. Not because of Derek's words. Derek was nothing, a fly buzzing against a window pane. She cried because the sheer, crushing weight of the secret she was carrying felt heavier than the child itself. The bus ride to her apartment took 40 minutes. Chloe sat by the window, her forehead resting against the vibrating, grime-streaked glass. The smell of diesel fumes and wet wool filled the cramped space. Every pothole sent a shockwave up her spine, aggravating the dull ache in her lower back. She lived in a neighborhood that the city had long ago forgotten. The streetlights here were mostly broken, and the sidewalks were cracked, pushing up weeds that smelled like dust and feral cats. She climbed the 3 flights of stairs to her apartment, slowly pausing on the second landing to catch her breath. Her key stuck in the lock, requiring a violent jiggle before it gave way. She pushed the door open, immediately, hit by the familiar depressing scent of her life, mildew, cheap lemon dish soap, and the lingering odor of the neighbor's burnt cooking oil. She dropped the plastic grocery bag on the scratched Formica counter. The tin of soup rolled out, hitting the wall with a hollow thud. Chloe didn't pick it up. She walked straight to the bathroom, flipping on the harsh overhead light. She stood before the mirror and pulled the heavy cardigan off, letting it drop to the peeling linoleum floor. She lifted her faded t-shirt. Her stomach was taut, the skin stretched thin and marked with a faint roadmap of pale blue veins. It wasn't the perfectly round, glowing bump plastered across maternity magazines. It looked heavy. It felt invasive. She rested both hands on the curve, feeling the warmth of her own skin. It had been one night, one terrifying, blood-soaked, adrenaline-fueled night 5 months ago. She had been working the graveyard shift at a private, off-the-books clinic on the edge of the financial district. She wasn't a doctor, just a glorified nurse's aide who knew how to stitch a wound and keep her mouth shut, a skill set that paid triple her previous hospital salary. They had brought him in through the back alley entrance. 2 massive men in tailored suits ruined by rain and arterial spray, dragging a third between them. Dominic Russo. Chloe had known the name. Everyone in the city knew the name, even if they pretended they didn't. He was the head of the Russo family, a man who dealt in commodities that moved in the dark. But that night, he hadn't looked like a kingpin. He looked like a piece of butchered meat. A bullet had torn through his shoulder, and another had grazed his ribs. The on-call doctor had been a trembling mess. Chloe had been the one to hold the pressure, her hands slipping in the slick hot crimson, pooling on the steel table. The smell of copper had been so strong she could taste it. Throughout the excruciating extraction of the bullet, Dominic hadn't screamed. He had just stared at her. His eyes were a pale, striking grey, stark against the sweat and blood smearing his face. She had stayed with him in the recovery room. It wasn't her job, but the silence of the clinic had been oppressive, and his breathing had been shallow. Sometime around 4 a.m., the fever had broken. He had grabbed her wrist. His grip was a vice, hot and desperate. What happened next wasn't romance. It wasn't a tender meeting of souls. It was a raw, primal collision of survival and shock. He was alive, and she was the anchor, tying him to that fact. He had pulled her down, and she, fueled by the exhausting, dizzying high of cheating death, hadn't fought him. It was frantic bruising and silent, save for the ragged sound of their breathing in the sterile dark. He was gone before her shift ended, leaving nothing but ruined sheets and a thick stack of $100 bills on the bedside table. Chloe hadn't touched the money. She had quit the next day, changing her phone number and moving across town. She thought she had escaped the orbit of the underworld. Then, 6 weeks later, the morning sickness began. Standing in her bathroom now, Chloe let out a dry, humorless laugh. Derek thought she was fat. Derek thought she had given up. If only he knew that every pound she had gained was a death sentence. Dominic Russo was not a man who shared. He was not a man who allowed loose ends, let alone a living, breathing piece of his legacy, walking around in a ratty sweater in the slums. If he found out, he wouldn't whisk her away to a penthouse and buy her diamonds. He would take the child and she would disappear. Women like her didn't get the fairy tale ending in his world. They got a shallow grave in the pine barrens. She turned off the bathroom light, plunging herself into darkness. The baby kicked again, a sharp jab against her ribs. "I know," she whispered to the empty room. "I know." She went to the kitchen, opened the tin of soup, cold, and ate it straight from the can, the metallic taste lingering on her tongue as the paranoid silence of the apartment pressed in around her. A week passed. The memory of Derek in the grocery store faded, replaced by the relentless grinding routine of survival. Chloe had found a job working the counter at a dry cleaner's 3 blocks from her apartment. It paid under the table, and the owner, an elderly Korean woman named Mrs. Park, didn't ask questions. The shop was a stifling box that constantly smelled of scorching heat starch and the sharp chemical tang of perchloroethylene. The humidity made Chloe's hair frizz and clung to her skin like a second unpleasant layer of clothing. But she liked the noise, the constant hiss of the steam presses and the mechanical whir of the clothing racks drowned out the anxious hum in her head. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The rain outside was relentless, a torrential downpour that turned the streets into grey, rushing rivers. The bell above the door chimed, cutting through the hiss of the steam press. Chloe didn't look up immediately. She was struggling to pin a tag onto the lapel of a heavy wool coat, her thick fingers fumbling with the safety pin. "Just a minute," she called out, her voice raspy from the chemical fumes. She finally secured the pin and wiped her damp forehead with the back of her wrist, turning toward the counter. The man standing there was entirely out of place. He wasn't one of the tired businessmen or exhausted mothers who usually frequented the shop. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Chloe's annual rent. A black umbrella dripped a neat puddle onto the checkered linoleum floor. He wasn't Dominic, but Chloe knew instantly, with a sickening drop in her stomach, what he was. He had the same rigid, hyper-aware posture as the men who had dragged Dominic into the clinic months ago. He didn't approach the counter. He just stood there, his eyes fixing on her. They were dead eyes. Professional. Calculating. They dropped to her swollen stomach, hidden beneath an apron, and then back up to her face. Chloe's breath seized. The air in the dry cleaners suddenly felt too thin to breathe. The chemical smell turned cloying, suffocating her. Her heart began to hammer, a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Flight, her brain screamed. Run! But there was nowhere to go. The back door was padlocked from the outside, a fire hazard Mrs. Park ignored. The man reached into his jacket. Chloe took a step back, knocking over a jar of spare buttons. It shattered against the floor, a loud, chaotic scatter of plastic that sounded like gunfire in the tense silence. The man pulled out a phone, not a weapon. He tapped the screen, held it to his ear, and never took his eyes off her. "I found her," he said. His voice was a low rumble, barely audible over the rain beating against the front window. He hung up and slipped the phone back into his pocket. He didn't move. He didn't try to touch her. He just stood like a sentinel by the door. "What do you want?" Chloe managed to choke out. Her voice shook entirely, lacking the tough, cynical veneer she relied on. She wrapped her arms around her stomach in an instinctive protective gesture. The man ignored her. 5 minutes passed. To Chloe, it felt like 5 years. The steam press hissed. The buttons lay scattered on the floor. She could feel the sweat trickling down the back of her neck, cold and clammy. Then the bell chimed again. The tall man stepped aside, opening the door wider. The smell entered before he did. It cut entirely through the cheap chemicals and the damp air of the shop. It was the scent of rain on expensive wool dark leather and a very subtle, sharp cologne. Chloe backed up until her spine hit the metal counter. The cold steel bit through her shirt. Dominic Russo stepped inside. He looked different than the last time she had seen him. He wasn't pale or bleeding. He looked carved from stone. His dark hair was slightly damp from the rain, and his jaw was set in a hard, unforgiving line. The grey eyes that had looked at her with feverish desperation were now sharp, clear, and terrifyingly cold. He didn't look at the racks of clothes. He didn't look at the broken jar of buttons. He looked only at her. The silence stretched, pulling tight like a piano wire about to snap. Dominic stepped closer. His polished leather shoes made no sound on the wet floor. He stopped mere inches from the counter, towering over her. Chloe couldn't breathe. She was a deer caught in the headlights of a semi-truck, paralyzed by the sheer gravity of his presence. His gaze dropped slowly, deliberately, to where her arms were crossed defensively over her swollen stomach. When he looked back up, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You're a very difficult woman to track down, Chloe," he said. His voice was smooth, a dark velvet that hid the razor blade underneath. "But you made a mistake." Chloe swallowed hard, tasting bile. "I didn't take your money," she whispered, her voice trembling so violently she barely recognized it. Dominic tilted his head slightly, a gesture that was predatory in its slow grace. He reached across the counter. Chloe flinched, closing her eyes, expecting a blow. Instead, she felt the warm, heavy weight of his large hand settle directly over hers where they rested on her stomach. He didn't grab her. He just rested his palm there, claiming the space, claiming what was beneath the skin. "I don't care about the money," Dominic said softly, his thumb brushing against her knuckle. "You took something else that belongs to me, and we are going to fix that right now." Chloe didn't scream. The movies always got that wrong. When real paralyzing terror hit, it didn't vocalize. It sucked the oxygen from the room and turned your vocal cords to useless, rigid rubber. Dominic's hand was heavy. The heat of his palm bled through the thin cotton of her maternity shirt, a localized brand that made the skin underneath crawl. He wasn't crushing her. The terrifying part was how gentle the contact was, a possessive, calculated pressure that communicated total ownership without leaving a bruise. "My coat," Chloe said. Her voice was a pathetic, reedy scrape. It was the most absurd thing she could have focused on, but her brain scrambled for the mundane to stave off the abyss. "It's cold outside. I need my coat." Dominic withdrew his hand slowly. He didn't look at her face. His eyes remained fixed on the swell of her stomach for a fraction of a second longer, before snapping to the tall man by the door. "Get her coat, Leo," Dominic ordered. The man Leo stepped forward, his wet shoes squeaking slightly on the linoleum. He grabbed Chloe's faded olive parka from the plastic hook near the break room door. He held it out, not quite handing it to her, but expecting her to put her arms through it, like a toddler. Chloe snatched it from his grip. Her hands were shaking so badly she missed the armhole twice. She shoved her arms in the cheap, synthetic lining, catching on her rough knuckles. She looked over her shoulder at the back room. The steam press was still hissing. "I can't just leave," she mumbled, zipping the coat over her bump, the zipper straining at the bottom. "Mrs. Park is in the back. She can't run the front counter alone. Her hips, Chloe." Dominic's voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the mechanical noise of the dry cleaners like a scalpel. The dry cleaners does not matter anymore. Walk to the car. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a gravitational pull. She walked. The bell above the door chimed a cheerful, mocking goodbye as Leo held the door open. The rain hit her instantly cold and sharp, plastering her frizzy hair to her cheeks. Dominic walked beside her slightly, behind a solid wall of dark wool and dangerous intent. He held an umbrella over her, completely ignoring the fact that his own shoulder was getting soaked. A black SUV idled at the curb, its engine a low, menacing purr that vibrated in Chloe's teeth. The street was empty. The usual neighborhood junkies and stray dogs had taken cover from the deluge. There were no witnesses. Even if there were, no one in this zip code would intervene when a car like that was involved. Leo opened the back door. The interior smelled like expensive leather ozone from the air conditioning, and a faint hint of peppermint. Chloe hesitated, her worn canvas sneaker pausing on the wet curb. She looked at Dominic. The streetlights caught the sharp angle of his jaw, the wet strands of dark hair plastered to his forehead. "If I get in there," she said, the rain mixing with the sudden hot tears stinging her eyes, "I don't ever come back out. Do I?" Dominic looked down at her. His expression was unreadable, a smooth mask of pragmatic cruelty. "You were carrying a Rousseau in a slum, Chloe. You never had a choice to begin with. Get in the car." She climbed in. She had no energy left to fight. The heavy door slammed shut behind her, plunging her into a soundproof, climate-controlled vault. Dominic slid in the other side. The car pulled away from the curb before she even had her seatbelt fastened. She fumbled with the buckle, her swollen fingers slipping on the metal. Dominic watched her struggle for a moment, then reached over. He didn't ask. He brushed her hands aside, pulled the strap across her chest and clicked it into place, making sure the lap belt rested low beneath the firm curve of her stomach. The intimate domestic action, performed by a man who ordered executions before breakfast, made Chloe's stomach heave. She turned her head away, staring out the tinted window. The grimy, neon-lit streets of her neighborhood blurred past. The cheap bodegas, the overflowing dumpsters, the pawn shops, they were miserable, but they were hers. She had carved out a miserable, anonymous little life there. Now she was a hostage, a fleshy incubator for a man who bought human lives with the same casual detachment others used to buy coffee. Her lower back throbbed a deep, grinding ache that usually signaled she had been standing too long. Instinctively she shifted, trying to find a comfortable position on the stiff leather seat. To her absolute cynical disgust, the seat was heated. The warmth seeped into her aching lumbar spine, providing immediate euphoric relief. She closed her eyes, hating herself for the small sigh that escaped her lips. She was being kidnapped by the Mafia, and her treacherous pregnant body was grateful for the heated seats. Dominic didn't say a word for the entire 40-minute drive. He sat in the opposite corner of the spacious back seat, his long legs stretched out, tapping a rhythm on his phone screen. He was already working, already moving on to the next logistical problem. She was just a piece of misplaced cargo that had finally been retrieved. The estate wasn't in the city. It was perched on a sprawling, heavily wooded property, an hour north, accessible only by a winding private road that lacked streetlights but boasted 3 separate security gates. When the SUV finally parked beneath a massive stone portico, Chloe felt entirely hollowed out. The adrenaline had crashed, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. She unbuckled her belt, her fingers stiff. Leo opened the door. The air here smelled entirely different. Pine needles, wet earth, and something crisp and clean that didn't exist in her old neighborhood. Dominic was already out waiting for her. He didn't offer his hand. He simply expected her to follow. They walked through heavy oak double doors into a foyer that was obscenely large. The floor was polished marble that echoed with every step, and a massive, hideous crystal chandelier hung from the vaulted ceiling. It didn't look like a home. It looked like a high-end hotel lobby devoid of guests. It was cold, sterile, and perfectly controlled. "Take her coat," Dominic said to a quiet, older woman in a severe black dress who materialized from a hallway. Chloe shed the wet parka, instantly self-conscious. Without the heavy coat, her condition was on full display. The oversized, pill-covered cardigan did nothing to hide the 5-month swell of her stomach in the bright, unforgiving light of the chandelier. She felt dirty. Her sneakers left dull smudges on the pristine marble. Dominic finally turned to look at her fully. He took in her damp hair, the dark, bruised circles under her eyes, the cheap clothes, and the protective way she wrapped her arms around her middle. A muscle feathered in his jaw. It was the first crack in his facade she had seen all night. "You look ill," he stated bluntly. Not a question, a clinical observation. "I've been working 10-hour shifts on my feet, breathing dry-cleaning chemicals, Dominic," she snapped. The exhaustion had finally eclipsed the fear, leaving behind a brittle, reckless anger. "Forgive me if I don't look like a cover girl." He didn't rise to the bait. "Dr. Orris is waiting upstairs. He will examine you." Panic flared again, cold and sharp. "I don't want a doctor. I want to lie down." "You don't dictate the terms of your medical care anymore," Dominic said, stepping closer. The scent of his cologne, sharp, dark, expensive, enveloped her. "You have compromised your health, and by extension, my child's health. You will see the doctor, or I will have Leo carry you up the stairs." Chloe stared at him, searching those pale grey eyes for a bluff. There was none. He would absolutely have his muscle haul her up like a sack of flour. "Point the way," she muttered, the fight draining out of her, leaving only a bitter residue. The examination room was a converted guest bedroom. It looked like a miniature high-end clinic. A sleek stainless steel exam table sat in the center of the room, flanked by an ultrasound machine that looked newer than anything she had ever seen at the free clinic she frequented. Dr. Harris was a small, meticulous man with wire-rimmed glasses who smelled strongly of hand sanitizer. He asked her to change into a remarkably soft, thick cotton gown. When she emerged from the adjoining bathroom, Dominic was sitting in a leather wingback chair in the corner of the room. Chloe froze. "He's not staying." Dr. Orris looked nervously between them. Dominic crossed his legs, resting his elbows on the armrests, his fingers steepled. "I am staying," Dominic said. "Proceed, doctor." "I have a right to privacy," Chloe argued, her voice rising. "You can't just... Privacy is a privilege you surrendered when you decided to hide my heir in a slum." Dominic interrupted his voice, dangerously low. "Get on the table, Chloe. Do not make me repeat myself." She hated him then, a pure, blinding hatred that tasted like ash in her mouth. She hated her own weakness as she climbed awkwardly onto the paper-lined table, the crinkling sound deafening in the quiet room. She lay back, staring fiercely at the recessed lighting in the ceiling as Dr. Aris squirted cold gel onto her bare stomach. The doctor moved the transducer over her skin. The room filled with a sudden rhythmic sound. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. It was fast, steady, and incredibly loud. The heartbeat. Chloe squeezed her eyes shut, a rogue tear slipping down her temple and into her hairline. She had heard it before at the free clinic, but it hit harder here in this sterile room surrounded by enemies. It was the sound of her own trap snapping shut. Dominic stood up. She heard his expensive shoes cross the floor. He stopped beside the table looking at the monitor. "Growth is in the 50th percentile," Dr. Aris murmured, tapping the keyboard. "Heart rate is strong. 155 beats per minute. Fluid levels look adequate. She is underweight, however. Blood pressure is slightly elevated. Stress likely." "Fix the weight," Dominic ordered. Chloe opened her eyes, glaring at his profile. "I'm not a prize heifer." Dominic finally looked down at her. His gaze dropped to her stomach, covered in slick gel, and then back to her face. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked entirely, terrifyingly resolute. "No," Dominic said, softly, reaching out. He didn't touch her skin, but his finger traced the edge of the ultrasound screen, outlining the grainy black and white curve of the spine. "You are the mother of my child, which makes you the most valuable, heavily guarded asset I possess." Dinner was an exercise in psychological warfare. They sat at opposite ends of a mahogany table that could easily seat 20 people. The dining room was suffocatingly grand, with dark wood paneling and heavy velvet drapes that shut out the night. Chloe wore clothes she had found in the closet of the massive impersonal bedroom. They had dumped her in a pair of soft cashmere sweatpants and a loose silk long-sleeved shirt that clung to the swell of her belly. The clothes smelled like lavender and expensive detergent, entirely devoid of her own scent. A silent, efficient maid had served them. The plate in front of Chloe held a piece of pond-sard salmon, steamed asparagus, and wild rice. It was exactly the kind of nutrient-dense, perfectly portioned meal a high-priced doctor would recommend. Chloe stared at it. Her stomach roiled. For the past 2 months, she had survived on instant ramen saltines and the occasional bruised apple from the discount bin. Her body was screaming for cheap carbohydrates, entirely unequipped to handle rich, oily fish. She picked up her fork, pushed a spear of asparagus around the porcelain plate, and put the fork down. At the far end of the table, Dominic cut into a rare steak. He ate with the same methodical, controlled precision he applied to everything else. He didn't speak until half his plate was cleared. "You aren't eating." He didn't look up, his voice echoing slightly in the large room. "I'm nauseous," Chloe said flatly, "and I don't like salmon." Dominic paused, his knife resting against the china. He looked up, his grey eyes pinning her down. "Dr. Aris said you are malnourished. The fish is rich in omega-3s. It is necessary for fetal brain development. Eat it." Chloe let out a sharp, cynical laugh. It scraped her throat. "Oh, I see. We're doing this. The benevolent dictator routine. You think because you kidnapped me and put me in a cashmere sweater, I'm suddenly going to take orders on how to chew my food." "I expect you to act in the best interest of the child," Dominic replied evenly, taking a sip of red wine. "Since your track record so far involves hiding in a roach-infested apartment and starving yourself, I am stepping in." Chloe gripped the edge of the table. The smooth, polished wood felt cold beneath her damp palms. "I didn't starve myself," she hissed, leaning forward. "I worked. I paid rent. I survived. Do you know why I hid, Dominic? Do you honestly think I wanted to raise a kid smelling like cheap bleach and old fry grease? Then why run?" He countered, his voice devoid of emotion. You knew what I was. You knew I had resources. Because of what you are, Chloe shouted, the sudden volume startling even herself. She didn't care. The exhaustion had stripped away her filter. You're a mob boss, a criminal. People shoot at you for a living. I was there, remember? I held my hands inside your bleeding shoulder while you ruined a perfectly good steel table. She pushed her chair back, the heavy wood scraping loudly against the rug. She stood up her hand, dropping instinctively to support the heavy weight, low in her pelvis. You think this is a safe environment? She demanded, gesturing wildly around the opulent room. You think having armed guards at the door makes a good nursery? What happens when one of your rivals decides to send a message? What happens if they bypass your fancy gates? Dominic didn't yell back. He didn't stand up. He simply watched her, his expression hardening into a terrifying, rigid mask. No one touches what is mine, he said. The absolute certainty in his voice made the hair on Chloe's arms stand up. My enemies know the cost of crossing that line. My father made mistakes. I do not. Everyone makes mistakes, Chloe shot back, her voice shaking with raw, desperate fear. And when you make one, it won't be your bank account that suffers. It will be him. She pointed to her stomach. Or her. They'll use this baby to break you. And I refuse to let my kid be collateral damage in a mob war. Dominic slowly wiped his mouth with a linen napkin. He placed it neatly on the table, stood up, and walked toward her. The predatory grace of his movement made Chloe instinctively take a step back, her spine hitting the heavy sideboard behind her. He stopped inches away. He was too tall, too broad. He eclipsed the light from the chandelier, casting her in shadow. You are looking at this emotionally. Dominic said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate rumble that vibrated against her chest. Look at it logically. You were a target the moment my blood began growing inside you. If you were on the street, exposed, a rival family would have found you eventually. They would have cut the child out of you to send me a message and left you to bleed to death in an alley. Chloe gagged, a violent, involuntary reflex. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening in horror. Dominic didn't flinch. He reached out his large hand, gripping her chin, forcing her to look up into his cold, merciless eyes. That is the reality of the world you entered the night you let me touch you, Chloe, he said brutally. I am not keeping you here to punish you. I am keeping you here because this fortress is the only reason you and that child will live to see the end of the year. He released her chin, his thumb lingering for a brief, confusing second against her lower lip. Now, he said, turning back toward the table. Sit down and eat the fish. Chloe stood frozen against the sideboard, her heart hammering a frantic, sickly rhythm against her ribs. The smell of the seared salmon suddenly hit her again, thick and oily. She turned, practically running out of the dining room, her heavy, uncoordinated footsteps echoing in the massive hallway. She barely made it to the extravagant downstairs powder room before she threw up violently into the marble sink, sobbing dry, ugly tears, not from morning sickness, but from the crushing claustrophobic realization that Dominic Rousseau was entirely right. She was already dead out there. In here, she was just a prisoner, waiting for the executioner to arrive. The mattress was an engineered marvel of memory foam and Egyptian cotton, and Chloe hated it with a visceral intensity. She woke up at 3:14 a.m., the digital clock on the mahogany nightstand projecting the time in a muted, unobtrusive blue. The silence of the estate was absolute. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a country night. It was a pressurized artificial vacuum. She rolled onto her side, biting the inside of her cheek as a sharp, agonizing cramp seized the round ligament on her right side. The baby felt heavier tonight, sitting low against her pelvis, like a bowling ball wrapped in lead. She kicked off the duvet. It was too heavy, too warm. She swung her legs over the edge of the bed, her bare feet hitting the heated hardwood floor. It was a minor luxury that made her skin crawl. Everything in this house anticipated a need before she could even articulate it. It was the architecture of total control. She needed water. She bypassed the crystal carafe on her nightstand, filled daily by a silent housekeeper, and opted to walk. She needed to move to feel the mechanics of her own joints, to prove her body still belonged to her in some marginal way. The hallway was dimly lit by sconces that automatically adjusted to her movement. She walked slowly, one hand supporting the base of her swollen stomach, the other trailing along the silk-upholstered wallpaper. She felt massive, clumsy, and utterly exposed in the oversized t-shirt she had refused to trade for the imported silk nightgowns Dominic had provided. She reached the kitchen. It was an industrial-scale space of brushed steel black marble and terrifyingly sharp German knives magnetized to the wall. Dominic was sitting at the island. He didn't jump. He didn't turn around in surprise. He simply looked up from the glowing screen of a sleek laptop, a tumbler of amber liquid resting near his right hand. He wore a crisp white dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to the elbows, exposing the thick, corded muscles of his forearms and the edge of a jagged silver scar near his wrist. "You're awake," he stated. His voice was a low gravel that seemed to scrape against the polished surfaces of the room. "Astute observation," Chloe muttered. Her voice was raspy, dry from the climate-controlled air. She shuffled past him toward the massive double-door refrigerator. "There is water in your room." "I wanted to walk." She pulled the heavy metal handle. The cold air rushed over her flushed face, a temporary relief. She grabbed a plastic bottle of water, ignoring the filtered tap integrated into the marble sink. She twisted the cap, but her grip was weak. The plastic ridges dug painfully into her swollen, stiff knuckles. She gritted her teeth, twisting harder, a surge of irrational hot frustration welling in her chest. She wasn't going to ask him. She would shatter the bottle against the floor before she asked him for help. Suddenly, the bottle was taken from her hands. Dominic didn't say a word. He cracked the seal with an effortless twist of his wrist and handed it back to her. His fingers brushed hers. His skin was warm, calloused, and smelled faintly of expensive scotch and the metallic tang of gunpowder. Chloe snatched the bottle. She drank half of it in one go, the cold water hitting her empty stomach like a stone. "You are limping," Dominic observed. He closed the laptop screen. The kitchen plunged into a dimmer, more intimate shadow. "It's the round ligaments," she said, leaning her back against the cool steel of the refrigerator. "The baby is dropping. It pulls the muscles. It's normal." Dominic's eyes tracked the subtle wince that crossed her face as she shifted her weight. He stood up. The sheer size of him dominated the space, dwarfing the massive kitchen island. "Sit down," he ordered softly. "I'm fine, Dominic. I'm going back to bed." "Sit down, Chloe." It wasn't a request. The velvet had peeled back, revealing the iron underneath. She lacked the energy to fight him. She shuffled to one of the heavy leather bar stools and hoisted herself up, her breathing shallow. Dominic walked around the island. He didn't stop a polite distance away. He stepped directly between her parted knees, invading her personal space with a casual, terrifying entitlement. Chloe stiffened her hands, dropping to the seat on either side of her hips. "What are you doing?" "Which side?" he asked, ignoring her entirely. "Dominic, left or right, Chloe?" "I am losing my patience." "Right?" She snapped her face, burning. He knelt. The fabric of his tailored trousers pulled taut over his thighs. He reached out his large hands, finding her right leg. He pushed the hem of her oversized t-shirt up just a few inches, exposing her bare knee and the lower stretch of her thigh. Chloe held her breath. The contrast was absurd. A man who commanded an army of violent enforcers kneeling on a cold marble floor in the middle of the night. His thumbs found the tight-knotted muscle just above her hip bone. He didn't massage it like a spa technician. He applied deep, clinical, agonizing pressure. Chloe gasped, her hands flying out and gripping his shoulders instinctively. "Stop, that hurts. Breathe through it," he commanded, his eyes fixed on the task, his grip unyielding. "The muscle is spasming because you are carrying the weight unevenly. You need to release the tension or you won't sleep." She squeezed her eyes shut, her fingernails biting into the heavy cotton of his shirt. It was excruciating for 10 seconds, a white-hot flare of pain that made her eyes water. And then suddenly, the knot gave way. A deep, heavy warmth flooded the right side of her pelvis, erasing the grinding ache that had kept her awake for 3 nights straight. She let out a long, ragged exhale, her head dropping forward slightly. Dominic didn't move away. His hands remained resting lightly on her thighs. The silence returned thicker this time, heavy with an electric, confusing current. Chloe opened her eyes. She was staring directly at the pulse, beating steadily at the base of his throat. "Better?" he asked. His voice was quieter now, lacking the abrasive edge of command. "Yes," she whispered, hating the vulnerability in her own voice, hating that his touch had provided relief. He looked up, meeting her eyes. His gaze was heavy, analytical, tracing the dark circles under her eyes, the stray curls of hair sticking to her damp forehead. He didn't look at her with affection. He looked at her the way a man looks at the foundation of a house he is building, checking for cracks, assessing the structural integrity. "You need to eat more protein," he said, rising to his feet smoothly. The intimacy of the moment vanished, locked away behind a vault door. "I will have the chef adjust your meals tomorrow. Go to sleep, Chloe." He turned, picked up his laptop and his scotch, and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her alone with the cold hum of the refrigerator and the disturbing realization that she felt safer in his terrifying shadow than she ever had in the light. November brought a bitter, driving rain that stripped the trees bare and turned the perimeter of the estate into a landscape of grey mud and black iron. Chloe was 32 weeks along. The physical reality of the pregnancy had entirely consumed her. She moved with a heavy, deliberate waddle, her center of gravity pulled forcefully forward. Her ankles were permanently swollen, the skin tight and shiny. Derek's mocking voice occasionally echoed in her memory. You got fat, but it felt distant, the pathetic insult of a boy who couldn't comprehend the brutal, visceral machinery of creating human life. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The sky outside the library windows was a bruised, sickly purple. Chloe was sitting in a winged armchair, a thick fleece blanket draped over her legs, trying to focus on a paperback novel she had found in the vast, unread collection. She couldn't concentrate. The air pressure in the room felt off. Heavy. Thick. Dominic was standing by the massive stone fireplace. It wasn't lit. He had been on his phone for 45 minutes, speaking in rapid, clipped Italian. His voice lacked its usual smooth cadence. It was sharp, punctuated by hard consonants. He hung up, slipping the phone into the breast pocket of his suit jacket. He didn't turn to look at her. He just stared at the cold, empty hearth. "What is it?" Chloe asked. Her voice sounded thin in the cavernous room. Before Dominic could answer, the floor vibrated. It wasn't a sound, not at first. It was a physical tremor that started in the soles of Chloe's feet and traveled up her spine. A fraction of a second later, a dull, concussive thud echoed through the thick walls of the house. It sounded like a massive tree falling against the earth, but the vibration was too sharp, too mechanical. Dominic moved. The transition from stillness to kinetic violence was instantaneous. He didn't run. He lunged across the Persian rug, closing the distance between the fireplace and her chair in 3 massive strides. He hauled her up by her upper arm. His grip was bruising entirely, lacking the careful moderation he usually employed when touching her. "Move!" he barked. "Dominic, what?" "Shut up and walk. Now." The door to the library burst open. Leo stood there, a matte black assault rifle held tight against his chest. His usually calm face was pale tight with adrenaline. "West Gate is compromised. 2 vehicles. Heavy ordnance." Leo reported, his eyes scanning the hallway behind him. "They bypassed the outer sensors. They're on the driveway." "How long?" Dominic demanded, pushing Chloe toward a seemingly solid wall of oak bookshelves. 90 seconds before they reach the portico. Hold the choke point at the foyer. Do not let them breach the stairs. "Yes, boss." Leo vanished, the heavy door slamming shut behind him. Chloe's heart slammed against her ribs with the force of a hammer. The metallic taste of raw panic flooded her mouth. She couldn't breathe. The baby began to thrash violently, sensing the massive spike of cortisol in her bloodstream. Dominic reached past a row of leather-bound encyclopedias, his fingers finding a hidden recess. He pressed sharply. A section of the heavy oak shelving unlatched with a heavy pneumatic hiss, swinging inward to reveal a narrow steel-lined corridor, lit by harsh red emergency lights. "Get in," he ordered, physically shoving her forward. She stumbled into the corridor, her shoulder scraping against the cold steel. The air inside smelled of dust cedar and stale circulation. Dominic stepped in behind her. He grabbed a heavy metal handle on the back of the bookshelf and pulled. It locked into place with a deafening, terrifying clack, sealing them in absolute darkness, save for the blood-red glow of the overhead bulbs. They were in a safe room barely the size of a walk-in closet. There was a bench against one wall, a bank of monitors, currently displaying static, and an emergency medical kit. "Sit." Dominic pushed her down onto the bench. "What is happening?" Chloe gasped, her hands gripping her stomach. "Who is it?" "Rivals," Dominic said curtly. He wasn't looking at her. He was pulling a heavy tactical vest from a locker, set into the wall, strapping it over his tailored suit with sharp, jerky movements. He pulled a matte black handgun from a holster at the small of his back, checking the slide with a terrifying practiced efficiency. A faction from the city pushing their boundaries. They tracked a supply truck back to the perimeter. "You said we were safe here." She choked out tears of pure, undiluted terror, blurring her vision. "You said nobody could get in." "I was wrong," Dominic stated. It was the first time she had ever heard him admit a flaw. It terrified her more than the gunfire. A sharp, crackling sound erupted from outside the thick steel walls. Automatic weapons. The sound was muffled distant, but the cadence was unmistakable. The house was a war zone. Dominic racked the slide of his weapon. He turned to her. In the red emergency light, his face looked carved from marble. The grey eyes were entirely devoid of humanity. This was the man who had ordered executions. This was the monster the city feared. "Listen to me very carefully," he said, stepping close, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "The walls of this room are rated to withstand C4. The air is internally scrubbed. You do not leave this room. Even if you hear my voice outside pleading with you to open the door, you do not open it. You do not touch the release lever until Leo inputs the manual override code. Do you understand?" Chloe stared at him, her chest heaving. "Where are you going?" "They breached my property," Dominic said, a terrifying, quiet fury lacing every syllable. "I am going to remind them why that is a fatal error." "Dominic, no." Her hand shot out her fingers, wrapping around his thick wrist. It was an instinctual, stupid reaction. She didn't want to be alone in the red dark. She didn't want the father of her child to walk out and die on a marble floor. He stopped. He looked down at her small, trembling hand, gripping his wrist. He didn't pull away. For a fraction of a second, the lethal machine paused. He reached up with his free hand, his rough thumb swiping roughly across her cheek, catching a tear. It wasn't a gentle caress. It was a brand. "I am coming back," he said. The certainty in his voice was absolute. "Lock the door." He stepped backward, hitting the release latch. The heavy steel door swung open, letting in a wave of cold air and the sharp, acrid smell of burnt cordite. He stepped out, and the door slammed shut. The lock engaged automatically. Chloe was alone. She pulled her knees up as far as her swollen stomach would allow, wrapping her arms around herself, burying her face in her hands. The distant, muffled pops of gunfire echoed through the steel walls. She sat in the vibrating, blood-red silence, waiting for the heavy door to open, terrified of who would be standing on the other side. Time lost its shape. It could have been 20 minutes. It could have been 3 hours. The air in the safe room grew stale, thick with the scent of Chloe's own sweat and the metallic tang of adrenaline. The gunfire had ceased. The silence that followed was worse. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket that left her imagination to paint horrific, bloody murals on the blank steel walls. The baby was frantic, kicking and rolling with a painful intensity. Chloe pressed her hands firmly against her sides, rocking slightly on the hard bench, murmuring nonsense words of comfort into the dark. "It's okay. Shh. It's okay. We're okay." She was lying. Then the electronic keypad beside the door beeped. 3 short, sharp tones. A heavy clank echoed through the metal. The pneumatic seal hissed. Chloe shoved herself off the bench, pressing her back flush against the far wall. She grabbed a heavy metal flashlight from the emergency kit, gripping it with white knuckles ready to swing. The door swung outward. The hallway light spilled in, blindingly white, against the red emergency bulbs. A silhouette filled the doorframe, too broad to be Leo. It was Dominic. He stepped into the room. He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling in sharp, jagged movements. His suit jacket was gone. The white dress shirt was torn at the shoulder, and a dark, wet smear of crimson stained the fabric across his ribs. His face was smeared with soot. His knuckles split and bleeding. He looked at her, his pale eyes tracking her rigid posture, the heavy flashlight raised in her trembling hands. "Drop it," he rasped. His voice was ruined hoarse from shouting or smoke, she couldn't tell. Chloe dropped the flashlight. It hit the metal floor with a loud clang that made her flinch. The adrenaline crash hit her instantly, a massive, sickening wave of gravity that buckled her knees. Dominic closed the distance before she hit the floor. He caught her by the waist, hauling her upright. He smelled like ozone, copper, cold rain, and death. It was a horrifying, primal scent, and yet, as his solid arms wrapped around her, Chloe let out a fractured, ugly sob and buried her face in his intact shoulder. She wasn't crying out of relief. She was crying out of sheer, overwhelming fury. She pushed against his chest, her hands hitting the rigid plates of the tactical vest beneath his shirt. "You lied to me!" She screamed, her voice cracking, echoing violently in the small metal room. She hit him again, a weak, pathetic blow. "You said I was safe. You dragged me out of my life. You locked me in a cage, and you told me the monsters couldn't get in." Dominic didn't flinch. He absorbed her blows, his hands coming up to grip her wrists, pinning them firmly against his chest. "Look at me," he commanded. "I hate you." She sobbed, struggling against his grip, her wet face twisting in raw, uninhibited anguish. "I hate this. I hate that I need you to stay alive. I hate that my baby's father is a murderer." "Chloe, look at me." The sheer force of his voice broke through her hysteria. She stopped fighting her chest, heaving tears streaming down her soot-stained cheeks. She looked up. Dominic's face was inches from hers. There was no apology in his eyes. There was no regret. There was only a dark, terrifying possessiveness that stripped away any illusion of normalcy. "Your life before was an illusion," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh, ragged whisper. "You were playing house in a slum, hoping the world wouldn't notice you. The world noticed." He let go of one of her wrists. He took her trembling hand and pressed it flat against his chest, right over the heavy, frantic beating of his heart. "Those men out there," Dominic continued, his eyes burning into hers. "They didn't come for my money. They came for the woman carrying the Rousseau heir. They came to cut my legacy out of you." Chloe gasped, squeezing her eyes shut against the visceral horror of his words. Dominic's hand moved. He slid his palm down from her chest, resting it heavily over the tight, protruding swell of her stomach. The baby, agitated by the screaming, delivered a hard, sharp kick directly against Dominic's palm. Dominic froze. The muscle in his jaw clenched tight. He didn't pull away. He pressed his hand firmer against the curve, acknowledging the violent little life-demanding space within the chaos. "They failed," Dominic said softly, the lethal edge leaving his voice, replaced by something heavier, something permanent. "Because I killed them. Every single one of them who crossed my gates. I will burn this city to ash before I let anyone touch you. Do you understand?" Chloe opened her eyes. The naive, cynical girl who had let Derek insult her in a grocery aisle was entirely gone. In her place was a woman forged by terror, standing in a blood-red room, anchored to a monster by the child growing in her womb. This wasn't a romance novel. He wasn't going to reform. He wasn't going to leave the life. He was a creature of violence, and he had dragged her into his dark orbit, locking the door behind her. But as his rough, blood-stained thumb brushed a tear from her cheek, Chloe realized the terrifying truth. She didn't want him to let her go. Out there, she was prey. In here, in the cold, brutal arms of the devil himself, she was untouchable. "You're bleeding," she whispered, her voice deadened, entirely devoid of fight. Her hand moved from his chest, her fingers hovering over the crimson stain on his ribs. Dominic looked down at her hand, then back up to her face. A slow, heavy exhaustion settled over his features, cracking the marble mask. "It's not my blood," he replied simply. He didn't let go of her. He wrapped his arm around her shoulders, turning her toward the open door. The hallway outside was quiet now, smelling of bleach and the sharp tang of cleaning chemicals, as Leo's men began the grim work of erasing the breach. "Come," Dominic said, guiding her heavy, exhausted body out of the steel box. "You need to rest. The doctor is coming to check the fetal heart rate." Chloe leaned into his side, her hip bumping against the heavy holster at his waist. She didn't pull away from the weapon. She let the heavy, solid weight of him support her waddling, uneven steps. The cage was locked. The key was thrown away. But as they walked through the ruined, opulent halls of the estate, Chloe placed her hand over his, where it still rested protectively on her stomach, accepting the darkness, if it meant the child beneath her heart would survive to see the dawn.